Today is one of our special Sundays in the church year. Today is Transfiguration Sunday. Today we celebrate when Jesus' appearance changed into a divine form on a mountaintop with 3 of his disciples. Transfiguration is about astonishment. It's about amazement. It's about awe. It also seems fitting that we wrap up our Where You Are sermon series and this portion with the far horizons today with the Transfiguration, since it is the most quintessential mountaintop experience, a glimpse of divine glory, a word from God, and an experience that changes all who were present. Prayer continues to be the critical aspect of Luke's gospel. The reason for Jesus' withdrawal to the mountain was for the purpose of prayer. He wanted to get away from the crowds and all the people for a bit and spend some time in quiet, relatively solitary prayer. I love how Jesus takes time repeatedly to separate himself from all the chaos and busyness of the world to find time for quiet prayer. Our lives are hectic and chaotic. Everything always seems to be going a mile a minute. We are constantly being bombarded with information. It's easy to become overwhelmed and lose track of the things that are really important. Jesus routinely takes time to recenter himself, and he does so by pulling away from everything for a time and praying. I love camping and hiking. When I go camping, I like to try to find some place that has no signal and is not terribly crowded with other people. It's part of the reason why I usually avoid paid campsites. But this gives me a chance to be alone with God, with my thoughts and my prayers, surrounded by only the beauty that God created. I always come back feeling refreshed and refocused. This ended up being more than just a nature retreat for Jesus and his disciples, though, as they went up the mountain. It turned into a true mountaintop experience that came while Jesus was in prayer. This moment has several ties to Jesus' baptism, the first of which being that they both occur in the context of prayer. While he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. That is pretty much all the description that we get of the actual transfiguration, the actual transformation of Jesus' divine glory. This isn't limited to just Luke's version, though. Matthew and Mark both record the transfiguration as well, but with little additional detail. Most of the difference is in the description of the transfiguration, as far as how they word the language used to describe it. Matthew says, "He was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light." Mark goes into a little more description of his clothing, saying he was transfigured before them, and his clothing became dazzling bright, such as no one on earth could brighten them. But most of that extra description that he gives is just to explain how bright his clothing was. Part of the lack of description comes from the inability to put into words the glory that they saw. Think about the most amazing, the most beautiful sight that you have ever seen. Maybe it was your spouse on your wedding day. Maybe it was an amazing sunrise or sunset. Maybe it was the first time you saw your child. Now, try to sum all of that up in just a sentence or two. Try to put it into just a few words. We can, but it doesn't really catch the full wonder and glory of that moment. And if we try to expand upon it, adding more words to try to better describe it, we usually still don't catch that full feeling of the vision, and it can end up cheapening the experience. The disciples got to see the glory of God, even if it was only a small peek or just a sliver of it. I imagine that would be even harder to put into words. It was an experience that was completely indescribable. It was too important for them not to include it, but they couldn't just say Jesus transformed and it was beyond words. So they did the best that they could to hint at the full glory, to give just enough description that you can almost imagine it for yourselves, but not lessen the experience in the process. During the Exodus, whenever Moses would speak with God, he would return with his face glowing and would have to put a veil over his face because of the radiance when not in the presence of God. The divine radiance from Jesus similarly confirms his presence with God. It also helps further show Jesus' divinity as God's Son. Since the transfiguration occurs shortly after Jesus predicted his own death, the radiance may also be foreshadowing of Jesus' resurrection and ascension. Now, speaking of Moses, both he and Elijah appear talking with Jesus. These two are two of the most famous leaders in Israelites' history. They both saw God's glory. They both had revelatory mountaintop experiences. They both came to their end of their lives at God's bidding. And they both came to be associated with traditions, Moses, the law, and Elijah, the prophets. Now, some translations will say that he departed instead, but what they were discussing with Jesus was Jesus' exodus, which he was about to fulfill in Jerusalem. Both Moses and Elijah knew a thing or two about exoduses, but in addition to them being able to relate at least to a small amount of what Jesus was about to go through, this also helped confirm the last part of Jesus' passion prediction. Now, this next part gets downplayed and written off a bit, blaming delirium or grogginess for Peter's words. It doesn't help Peter's case that it says that he spoke not realizing what he was saying when he wanted to set up dwellings or tents for Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. The term that Peter uses for the structures suggests that in the Transfiguration, he saw the fulfillment of Israel's celebration of the wilderness wanderings at the Feast of Tabernacles. He may have made the offer out of reverence for the occasion's sacredness. Perhaps it was a desire to show hospitality to the guests. It may have been a desire to prolong the experience or to commemorate the place. While Peter is saying all this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and a voice from heaven speaks to them from the cloud. This heavenly voice's response to Peter's offer shows that it is unnecessary, but also undeserving of any rebuke. That voice is the climax of the scene. This also harkens back to Jesus' baptism with the voice from heaven saying, "You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." When the voice first speaks to Jesus when the voice first speaks at Jesus' baptism, it precedes and empowers the first part of his earthly ministry. When it speaks for the second time at his transfiguration, it precedes and empowers the second part of that ministry. One important difference, however, is that at the baptism, the voice was speaking directly to Jesus, affirming to Jesus that he was the Son of God. Here, the voice speaks for all to hear, but it's meant less for Jesus and more for the spectators, hence the "listen to him" at the end. The command to listen to Jesus following his prediction of his own death and resurrection further reaffirms Jesus' claim. However, the fact that immediately after the voice speaks, Jesus is found alone, Moses and Elijah having departed, suggests that Jesus has superseded the law and the prophets. Now the command is listen to him, not to them. Despite Peter's desire to stay in that moment, Jesus and the disciples return from the mountaintop. They are met with a voice of another father. "Teacher, I beg you, look at my son. He is my only child." We've just gone from one father affirming his son, saying he is chosen and advising all to listen to him, to another father desperately pleading for his only son. The man's son is a silent victim in this story. He never speaks, He's unable to help himself, and he has no choice but to rely on his Father for assistance. The Father has already asked the disciples to help, and they were unable to cast out the demon. Now, Jesus' response can come across a bit angrily. "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I put up with you? How much longer must I be with you?" There are a few things that could account for Jesus' response. First, he may have been angry at the demon's power over the boy. However, the words that he used don't really imply that it was directed at the demon so much as the people around him, especially with his use of generation. Luke repeatedly uses generation or this generation in his gospel, and the way that Luke uses it is to refer to the people living during Jesus' time on earth, but usually specifically those who were witness to his ministry and were being criticized for their lack of faith or their unwillingness to accept Jesus' message. Especially with all of the hinting to and reaffirming of the coming passion, this may be referencing the people, the very people that he had came to save, rejecting him. So especially taking place right after the transfiguration, it may have been upsetting to have had that mountaintop experience only to come back and be so directly confronted with their lack of faith. It's possible that Jesus is upset with the disciples for their lack of ability to do anything for the boy. This section of the gospel tends to portray the disciples in a relatively poor light. Yes, they were successful when Jesus sent them out on mission. And yes, Peter did confess that Jesus is Christ the Messiah, but they weren't really ready to be witnesses. Jesus ordered them to tell no one about him yet. They don't fully understand the transfiguration experience. They aren't able to help the boy with the demon, and shortly after today's reading, they try to stop someone else who is casting out demons in Jesus' name. For this portion of the gospel, though, these failures are used as a backdrop for Jesus' teachings. Jesus may lament the faithlessness of this generation, but he continues to bear with the disciples and eventually dies for all, even those who reject him. It may even have been a combination of all three of these things that made his response come across so harshly. There is another thing that differentiates this exorcism from Jesus' earlier ones. In the past, when he cast out demons, they would shout out or call out Jesus' identity as the Son of God, and Jesus would rebuke them and keep them from being able to speak. This time, though, the demon doesn't declare Jesus' identity. The disciples themselves and the voice from heaven have already declared it. Before the demons were declaring it, before it was time. Hence why Jesus would silence them. The transfiguration and the voice from heaven publicly declared it, though, even if it was only a small group that it was initially declared to. Since there is no longer any need to hide the full greatness of Jesus, there is no point in the demon trying to reveal it before its time, since it's already been revealed. The response of the crowd reflects this as well. There is no questioning or confusion in the statement. All were astounded at the greatness of God. This is honest praise of God for Jesus' mighty act. They are coming to realize that Jesus is the Son of God. Despite the wonder of the transfiguration experience, the clarity that it gives Jesus' identity and significance, and the reaffirmation that it provides for his purpose, it does nothing to alter the challenges to come. The call of Jesus' ministry continues to lead him onward. Understandably, Peter may have wanted to stay there, to try to desperately hold on to that moment and that clarity, that purpose, and that understanding. But that wasn't an option. They needed to return, to come down from that mountaintop and descend back into the valleys and low places where all the hard work, healing, and teaching happened. While it is unlikely that any of us will have quite the mountaintop experience that Peter, James, and John did, there will be times in our lives where things seem so clear, where everything seems to make sense, where we feel incredibly close and connected to God. And maybe it'll be because of where we are and everything that we've accomplished. And as we look back at everything that led us there, maybe we're looking forward to the far horizons ahead of us, but from where we are can see a clear path and clearly see the destination and how to get there. We may feel tempted, as Peter was, to want to stay in that moment, to hang on to that clarity and marvel. But discipleship means following Jesus. We can't do that if we stubbornly stop and remain stationary. We have to keep going, to keep moving on. We may descend from the mountaintop into dense forests or dark valleys. The way ahead may be dark or difficult. We can't let our fear of that stop us, though. Instead of staying in place to try to preserve that moment, we should hold on to the memory of that clarity. Hold on to that view of our final destination or how far we have already came, and use that to help us through those difficult times. After all, Jesus' ministry is not transformative and redemptive because of what he did on the mountain, but what he did in the valleys and the wilderness areas elsewhere. Amen.